Water had reached the bottom edge of the tires when Rebecca Sloan, CEO of the Riverside Heritage Collection, pointed toward the black Duesenberg at the back of the underground room. "Pull the $3 million car first." Daniel Rusk, a 58-year-old single father, looked past it to a dented Oldsmobile wagon blocking the first turn. 5 collector cars stood trapped behind it. A stalled electric SUV narrowed the ramp, and Metrolift's new recovery truck was too tall to clear the concrete header. "Pull the Duesenberg first, and it blocks every car behind it," Daniel said. "Value doesn't decide the order. Geometry does." The fire chief raised one gloved hand. 75 minutes, then this level closes. Behind Daniel, his rust-streaked 1967 Ford F600 idled beneath the canopy. Riverside had rejected it that morning, as too ugly for donor-facing work. Now it was the only recovery vehicle that fit. Starting its winch would also cancel the $38,000 sale, keeping Daniel's shop afloat. Rainwater entered through a failed loading door barrier at the far side of the Riverside Heritage Collection in St. Louis. The storm had been forecast for 2 days. The first garage warning arrived that morning, but management delayed evacuation because 8 donors had flown in for a private preview. By the time Rebecca canceled the event, rising water had disabled the lower door motor, and an employee's SUV died while climbing the ramp. 6 vehicles remained below. That morning, the lower room had looked secure. The polished concrete reflected the cars, black curtains hid the maintenance walls, and catering tables stood beneath framed plans for a future expansion. Daniel arrived at 7 with the F600 to move 2 vehicles away from a ceiling leak before the preview. A security guard directed him to the service lot instead of the loading door. Neil Tolland met him there with a termination notice. Riverside had awarded all transport and recovery work to Metrolift, a regional company with a new rotating boom truck, uniformed crews, and a customer app that let donors watch deliveries. Neil praised Daniel's reliability but said the rusted Ford undermined the collection's public image. The new contract began immediately. Daniel asked whether Metrolift's truck had been clearance tested at the basement ramp. Neil showed him a specification sheet listing its collapsed boom height. The number was 3 inches below the concrete header, but it did not include the warning beacon, suspension rise at the grade brake, or space required for stabilizers. Daniel placed a folding rule under the header and showed that the approach angle reduced usable clearance before the truck reached level ground. "It won't get its rear axle past this break," Daniel said. Neil replied that the new contractor could recover from outside with its longer boom. Daniel pointed to the first turn, the center column, and the parking arrangement. A boom on the upper lot could not pull around 2 corners without anchors and pulleys. Neil ended the discussion. Daniel's contract allowed termination on 30 days' notice, and Riverside would pay that period without requiring service. Daniel had one accurate failure of his own. He had never converted his recovery plan into the collection's new digital asset system. The paper copy bore the former facilities director's signature, but not Rebecca's. When leadership changed, Daniel assumed the approved plan carried forward and continued sending weather reminders to a group address. He had not demanded an annual drill or obtained written acknowledgement from current management. He accepted the termination letter, loaded 2 unused wheel dollies, and drove back to Rusk Recovery. At 9:05, he sent Rebecca and Neil a final email. The river forecast had crossed the evacuation threshold named in his plan. 6 vehicles in the basement required approximately 50 minutes under dry conditions if the corner wagon moved first. He recommended immediate relocation before the preview. Neil answered at 9:22 that the flood barrier was certified and Metrolift was on standby. Rebecca was copied. She was meeting donors and read only the first line on her phone. She trusted the operations director she had hired 4 months earlier. That decision was understandable at 9 in the morning. By early afternoon, it became the reason Daniel's old email sat at the center of an emergency command board. The fire department had isolated the collection room from ordinary power. Once water reached the barrier's sensor cabinet, firefighters locked out its controls. Only emergency lighting, command radios, and designated conservation equipment remained on a separate service that the chief would disconnect at 4:05. Nobody would work in water deeper than the limit marked on their boots. Nobody would climb into a vehicle or attempt to start an engine. Daniel's crew would handle lines from the dry ramp and raised side walkways. The fire chief, not Rebecca, held final safety authority. Daniel refused to begin until those rules appeared in writing. Rebecca's operations director called the delay reckless. Daniel called an uninsured, improvised recovery more reckless. His standard contract had been terminated that morning, and he would not turn the same employees into free heroes because management wanted 6 cars back. Rebecca signed a 1-page emergency work order drafted by her counsel. It placed recovery sequence and rigging decisions under Daniel, required museum staff to follow the fire chief, covered damage caused by authorized extraction, and paid Daniel's published emergency rate. It did not guarantee that every vehicle could be saved. Daniel signed beneath her and turned to his son. The order also acknowledged that Riverside had requested Daniel after terminating his standing contract. That sentence mattered to his crew's insurer. Without it, the company could later call the rescue an unauthorized return to private property. Rebecca added a clause giving Daniel access to floor plans, keys, vehicle records, and certified anchors. Daniel added one allowing him to stop without penalty if measured load, water depth, electrical status, or personnel access exceeded safe limits. Rebecca's counsel asked whether 6 separate owner approvals were needed because 2 cars belonged to lenders and 1 was on consignment. The registrar produced custody agreements granting Riverside emergency authority to protect stored property. Daniel would act for the collection, not negotiate with each owner while water rose. The legal question took 3 minutes and prevented a later dispute about who had authorized contact with the vehicles. Metrolift's supervisor signed as a cooperating contractor. His modern truck could not enter the basement, but his crew and compact staging tractor remained useful for moving recovered cars out of the F600's line. Daniel assigned them that role. The morning's competitor became part of the operation because equipment limits, not pride, determined the work. "Start the clock, Jonah." Jonah Rusk pressed the timer on the magnetic planning board. It showed 1 hour, 13 minutes, and 28 seconds after the paperwork pause allowed by the chief. He was 22, a certified rigger, and the only person besides Daniel who knew the floor plan from memory. He had spent the summer painting load ratings beside anchor points Daniel installed 3 years earlier. Management had called the white markings ugly and ordered them covered with gray floor paint before the donor preview. Jonah carried photographs showing every anchor before it disappeared. He also carried an unsigned cancellation notice for the sale of the Ford Wrecker. Daniel had agreed to sell the truck that afternoon for $38,000 after losing the collection contract. The buyer's deposit was refundable if the truck performed any new commercial recovery before delivery. By starting the winch, Daniel had given up the sale that would have covered his shop's payroll and equipment note. The sale agreement waited in the F600's glove box. The buyer, a brewery owner named Cal Becker, wanted the truck washed, clear-coated, and parked beside a new tap room as a moving billboard. Cal appreciated the old winch but required Daniel to disconnect it before public display. He offered more than the truck's working market value because its faded lettering photographed well. Daniel accepted the deposit after Neil's notice left 3 employees with no scheduled collection work for the next month. He planned to replace the Ford with a used rollback that could earn more routine business. Jonah opposed the sale, not from nostalgia alone. The F600 carried 200 feet of cable and fit industrial spaces no rollback could. Daniel answered that rare usefulness did not pay weekly wages without contracts recognizing it. When Rebecca called at 2:10, Cal was already driving toward the shop with the balance. Daniel could have delivered the Ford and sent Metrolift to attempt the rescue. Instead, he told Cal the truck was being returned to commercial service under an emergency order. Cal reminded him of the condition and asked whether Daniel understood the deposit would come back that day. Daniel said he did. The earlier call gave Daniel and Jonah enough time to reach Riverside, inspect the command area, and complete the emergency paperwork before the countdown began. Jonah heard the call. He did not urge his father toward a grand sacrifice. He opened the business account on his phone and confirmed they could refund the deposit without missing payroll until Friday. The equipment note would remain uncovered. They were risking an asset, not food or an employee's earned check. He made that choice before knowing whether Rebecca would restore any long-term work. The emergency order paid for 1 rescue, not the future. The F600 had a narrow cab, a low fixed boom, and a power takeoff winch driven mechanically from the transmission. It could not rotate like the new $100,000 recovery unit parked uselessly outside. It could not lift a city bus or display live load charts on a screen. What it could do was sit below the header, send 200 feet of cable down the ramp, and redirect that pull through rated pulley blocks at known anchors. Daniel had built the original recovery plan after discovering that the basement's tight first turn prevented a straight tow. Every car position had a numbered exit path. The plan required the cheapest car at the corner to move first, because its empty space became a turning pocket for every vehicle behind it. Rebecca's former facilities director approved the layout, but Neil Tolland, the current operations director, filed it as obsolete when he replaced Daniel's company. Neil stood beside Rebecca now, holding an auction schedule on a tablet. He again argued for the Duesenberg, insured for more than $3 million. Water had reached the bottom edge of its tires. The Oldsmobile at the corner was worth less than its transport bill. Daniel handed him a grease pencil. Draw the Duesenberg's path without crossing another car. Neil stared at the plan and found none. Rebecca told Daniel to proceed in his order. Her decision came 9 minutes after she had tried to control it by price. It did not repair the morning's dismissal, but it removed one source of interference. The first vehicle was a 1971 Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser, used by the collection staff for parades and supply runs. Its transmission rolled in neutral, but the steering was locked because the ignition key had been moved to an upstairs display cabinet. A registrar sprinted for it until the fire chief stopped her from using the interior stairs. The safe route through the north corridor would take 12 minutes. Jonah offered an alternative already listed in Daniel's plan. Wheel dollies could carry the front wheels without unlocking the steering. 2 museum technicians brought the rated dollies from dry storage. Daniel inspected their pins and casters, then rejected one with a bent latch. The remaining pair carried the front axle within capacity. No one crawled beneath the car. Long-handled placement bars and the collection's shallow service jack allowed the team to position the dollies from the side walkway. Jonah connected the bridle to approved chassis points shown in the Oldsmobile service diagram. Daniel took slack until both legs shared the load. With 1 hour, 3 minutes, and 11 seconds left, the F600's winch began its first pull. Its straight-cut gears made a steady, low whine older than anyone except Daniel. The Oldsmobile rolled backward 6 feet, its locked steering supported by the dollies, then moved into the ramp line. A spotter called distances over hardwired headsets. Daniel stopped twice to correct caster angle. Speed would not recover time lost to a sideways car. The Oldsmobile cleared the basement in 7 minutes and 40 seconds. Metrolift's staging tractor moved it to the dry staging zone after the F600 released the line. The empty corner below created the space Daniel needed. Metrolift's supervisor, Marcus Lee, checked the Oldsmobile bridle as it came off the cable. He found equal witness marks and no chassis contact. Daniel asked Marcus to control the staging zone from that point forward. Every recovered car had to move at least 40 feet beyond the ramp before the next pull, with keys and custody tags transferred to the registrar. If the upper lot became disorganized, the basement cable could complete a perfect pull and still deliver a car into a blockage. Marcus assigned one of his technicians to photograph each connection after removal. The company app Neil had praised mainly as donor-facing technology became useful when Marcus configured it for condition evidence. Images uploaded against each vehicle record as the timer ran. Old and new methods supported one another. Jonah's paperboard controlled sequence, while Metrolift's system preserved copies away from the flooding building. Daniel checked the F600's winch brake temperature after the first pull. It remained well below the service limit he had written on the dash. He also examined the first 20 feet of cable for flattened strands. The old truck could keep pulling only if its condition stayed measured. Rust on the cab did not excuse a hot brake or damaged line. Water rose another half-inch. The second vehicle was a 1948 Packard Custom 8 in the deep left aisle. Its handbrake had been left engaged after a display move, and the release cable would not move from outside. The no-start rule also prevented using engine vacuum for any accessory. Daniel could not simply drag locked rear tires across the polished floor without risking suspension damage and losing control at the turn. The museum owned a second set of dollies, but they were rated for a lighter car. Daniel refused them. Neil suggested using skates under the tires. The floodwater had reduced friction enough that unsecured skates could slip on the ramp. The fire chief backed Daniel's refusal. Jonah studied the vehicle file and found a service access behind the rear seat. From the raised walkway, he could reach it through an already open rear door with a long-handled hooked release tool. Both feet and his torso remained outside the cabin. Daniel asked the chief for permission, then placed a safety observer beside him. The linkage moved after one controlled pull. Both rear wheels turned. That solution avoided the undersized dollies and closed the second blockage without improvising outside the plan. The Packard came through the new turning pocket with 52 minutes. and 46 seconds left. Its broad white wall tires left 2 clean arcs in the muddy film, confirming the exact space available for the next car. At the top of the ramp, one Packard tire began losing air through an aged valve stem. Marcus stopped the staging tractor, rather than dragging the soft tire across pavement. His crew placed a rated wheel skate beneath it and moved the car clear. The delay occurred outside Daniel's cable route and did not stop the basement sequence. A clear division of authority let 2 problems be handled at once, without competing commands. The fire chief placed a staff gauge at the barrier and called water level every 5 minutes. The rise was no longer uniform. Debris at the loading opening released in small surges, adding nearly an inch with 50 minutes left. The chief moved the closure time forward by 2 minutes to preserve his exit margin. Jonah crossed out 4-5 on the board and wrote 4-3. Nobody argued that the original promise should survive changed safety data. Rebecca watched him alter the clock and asked whether all 6 cars were still possible. Daniel said possible was not the same as assured. If the rise reached the lowest energized enclosure, if an anchor failed inspection, or if the SUV moved beyond its secondary chain, the operation would stop. She repeated those conditions to the command staff so no donor or owner could claim Daniel had made an unconditional promise. Rebecca watched employees attach condition tags in the staging zone. She asked the collection registrar why the 6 cars had not left when the first flood advisory arrived. The registrar produced 3 emails from Daniel sent over the previous 2 years. Each recommended moving basement vehicles whenever the river forecast crossed a named threshold. The most recent reminder had gone out at 8:17 that morning. Neil had replied that the preview schedule took priority because the flood barrier had passed inspection. The barrier had passed a motor test, not a full closure test under water pressure. A forklift pallet placed near its track for event setup prevented the final 6 inches of travel. When the motor met resistance, its controller tripped. Staff tried to reset it repeatedly until water reached the sensor cabinet, at which point firefighters locked out the barrier circuit. Rebecca did not fire Neil in the middle of the emergency. Removing an operations director during an active rescue could confuse authority and destroy information. She instructed counsel to preserve every warning, maintenance record, and event decision, then ordered Neil to report to the command post and stop directing the floor. With 49 minutes and 30 seconds left, Daniel turned toward the 2 cars in the far right corner, a 1965 Shelby GT 350 and a 1957 Mercedes 300 SL. The Mercedes was more valuable, but the Shelby occupied the outer path. Geometry made the decision again. The Shelby rolled freely. Its low front valence, however, could strike the ramp brake where the concrete angle changed. Daniel used a short adjustable towing beam from the F600, keeping the pull low rather than lifting the car by its bumper. Jonah placed 2 broad transition plates over the brake. The plates had been stored for exactly this purpose under Daniel's original plan. Neil's replacement contractor had moved them behind event crates. Retrieving them cost 4 minutes. Rebecca and 2 suited donors helped carry the lighter crate panels out of the access aisle under the chief's direction. She did not pose for the cameras. No media were allowed below the command floor. Her contribution was practical and late. Daniel accepted it without turning the rescue into forgiveness. The Shelby reached dry ground with 39 minutes and 58 seconds remaining. On the upper lot, the Shelby's owner called Rebecca directly and demanded that his car be moved into an enclosed trailer before the Mercedes came up. Rebecca refused. The enclosed trailer would occupy the dry staging lane and slow every later extraction. She offered a weatherproof cover and documented custody instead. It was the same principle Daniel had applied below. Individual value could not be allowed to block the common route. The owner threatened to withdraw 2 future loans. Rebecca told him the incident record would show her decision. Daniel heard only her side through the command headset, but the consequence was clear. She had begun the day protecting a donor preview at the expense of an evacuation threshold. She now accepted donor pressure as a cost of keeping the route open. Jonah used the pause between rigging changes to inspect the higher wall anchors they might need later. He could reach them from the dry raised walkway without entering the flooded floor. One tag was hidden behind event fabric, another behind an acoustic panel, and a third had passed inspection 6 months earlier. He reported their condition before the geometry required them. That preparation planted the solution to a problem no one yet knew the SUV would create. 3 vehicles remained. The Mercedes in the far corner, a 963 split-window Corvette near the center column, and the black 1931 Duesenberg closest to the failed barrier. Water now touched the bottom edge of the Duesenberg's wheel covers. The collection's appraiser announced that moisture near its exhaust and electrical connections could multiply restoration costs by hundreds of thousands of dollars. Rebecca asked if the Duesenberg could be next now that the outer aisle was open. Daniel walked the path with his eyes, then checked the floor marks beneath the water using Jonah's original photographs. Pulling the Duesenberg would require it to cross the center lane and occupy the only straight approach to the Mercedes. The Corvette might still exit through the left aisle, but the Mercedes would be trapped behind the Duesenberg's long wheelbase. Mercedes, Corvette, Duesenberg, Daniel said. The appraiser objected. The Duesenberg was worth more than both combined. Then it has the most to lose if I park it where I can't turn it. Rebecca confirmed the sequence. The Mercedes created the first serious rigging problem. Its tires had settled into shallow display cups, locked into recessed floor tracks by removable retaining pins. The cups prevented rolling until the car moved vertically by less than an inch, but the basement ceiling left no room for a conventional boom lift. Daniel's mechanical wrecker could pull but not safely lift from 40 yards away at that angle. His original plan specified 4 pneumatic lifting cushions stored in a wall cabinet above the expected flood line. The cabinet opened with a maintenance key. Neil's new contractor had changed the lock and failed to place the key in emergency control. Jonah found the lock number in a commissioning photograph and called the manufacturer from the command phone. The collection registrar verified ownership. A facilities locksmith at the scene opened the cabinet under Rebecca's written authorization. The delay consumed 5 minutes, but forcing the lock without authority would have cost more and damaged emergency equipment. The cushions lifted one wheel pair only high enough for technicians on the walkway to withdraw the retaining pins with long-handled tools and slide the cups along their recessed tracks. Rated crib blocks protected against loss of air. When all 4 tires were free, Daniel lowered the car completely before attaching the tow line. The operation was slow because nobody worked beneath a suspended vehicle. With 28 minutes and 17 seconds left, the Mercedes began moving. The long cable ran through the right side pulley anchor, across the dry edge of the room, and up the ramp to the Ford. Jonah called tension from the load cell installed between line and bridle. The readings remained below 1/3 of rated capacity. Halfway to the turn, the stalled electric SUV on the ramp shifted 3 inches. Its parking system had released as the 12-volt accessory battery failed. A wheel chock caught it, but the change narrowed the usable line between the SUV and the wall. Daniel stopped the Mercedes before its left mirror reached the choke point. The clock continued. Rebecca asked whether the modern recovery truck could pull the SUV from outside. Its boom could reach, but the truck's required stabilizer width would block the fire lane and Daniel's cable path. Moving it into position would consume at least 18 minutes. Daniel chose a smaller correction. The F600 repositioned 6 feet to the left, staying under the header. Jonah shifted the line to a higher certified anchor so it cleared the SUV's front corner. The new angle added side load. Daniel reduced it through a second pulley rather than dragging the Mercedes diagonally. The 300 SL cleared the ramp with 20 minutes and 42 seconds left. Its doors remained shut, its engine untouched, and its tires carried only a thin line of floodwater. The staging team rolled it onto dry, absorbent mats for conservation staff. Daniel stopped the winch for a 90-second inspection. The double redirection pull had built more heat than the first 3 recoveries combined. The brake temperature remained acceptable, but the outer cable layer had begun winding unevenly on the drum. Continuing without correction could crush lower wraps or make the next pull surge. Jonah directed the staging tractor to hold a light training load while Daniel respooled the working section under controlled tension. The task consumed time that could not be recovered. Rebecca asked whether the Duesenberg could be taken before the Corvette to avoid another long setup. Daniel pointed to the wooden panel wedged at the Corvette. Until that obstruction moved, the Duesenberg's turning path did not exist. He used the inspection delay to retire one pulley whose side plate showed a fresh edge mark from contact with an anchor shackle. A spare of equal rating came from the Ford side box. The damaged pulley probably could have completed one more pull. Probably was not a load rating. Just over 19 minutes remained for 2 cars. The Corvette stood closest to the direct ramp line and weighed less than every vehicle already moved. Under ordinary conditions, it would have been the easiest pull. Water had floated a wooden event platform into its left rear wheel. The panel wedged between the tire and a concrete column. Pulling forward would drive it deeper and risk cracking the fiberglass body. Daniel could wait for firefighters to cut the panel, but their saw team was occupied at the loading barrier. Jonah proposed reversing the Corvette 18 inches into the empty Shelby space, changing the contact angle so the panel could float free. The floor marks showed enough clearance if the front wheels stayed straight. Daniel made Jonah explain the entire path to both spotters. Then he gave him control of the short reverse pull, while Daniel watched the winch brake. It was the first time Daniel had placed his son in command during a high-value recovery. Jonah moved the Corvette 9 inches, stopped, corrected the bridle, and moved another 7. The wooden panel rotated away from the tire. A firefighter on the walkway caught it with a pike pole and secured it against the rail. Jonah then transferred control back to Daniel for the ramp pull. The Corvette cleared with 12 minutes and 36 seconds left on the temporary 4-3 deadline. At the loading opening, the debris surge finally cleared, and the rate of rise slowed. The fire chief reviewed 2 new gauge readings, restored the original 4-5 shutdown, and added 2 minutes back to the operational clock. Jonah wrote 4-5 beneath 4-3 and left both times visible with the chief's initials. The clock now showed 14 minutes and 36 seconds. Only the Duesenberg remained, the car Rebecca had wanted first. Its position was now open on 3 sides. Daniel could draw it through the center lane and use the empty Corvette space to align its long chassis with the ramp. The order had protected the most valuable car by postponing it until every obstruction was gone. The SUV shifted again. This time, the first wheel chock rolled on wet concrete. A secondary chain held, but the SUV moved far enough to block the lower half of Daniel's new cable angle. No person could safely enter between the vehicle and the wall. The modern truck still could not deploy without closing the fire lane. The fire chief called 13 minutes and 50 seconds to shut down. Water had reached the Duesenberg's running board brackets. He reminded Rebecca and Daniel that he would stop the operation if the SUV restraint worsened. The car's value had no weight in that decision. Daniel considered abandoning the final recovery. 5 cars were dry, every person was safe, and the remaining minutes included the pull, disconnection, and personnel accounting. He asked the chief for the route to exit time from the farthest walkway station. Firefighters had measured it at 90 seconds. The chief required a 3-minute reserve beyond that. All rigging activity therefore had to end with at least 4 minutes and 30 seconds still on the clock. Jonah reported that the high anchor route could be connected from the walkway in less than 2 minutes because he had prepositioned the spare pulley during the previous inspection. Without that earlier choice, Daniel would have stopped. With it, the measured schedule allowed 1 attempt and no reset. Daniel announced the stop conditions over every headset. If the load exceeded the plan, if the SUV chain moved, if the Duesenberg failed to reach the center turn by the 8-minute call, or if it had not crossed the closure line by the 5-minute call, he would lower tension, secure the car where it stood, and evacuate. Rebecca repeated that she accepted the possible loss. Only then did Daniel authorize the final connection. Daniel studied Jonah's old anchor photograph. The left wall carried a certified eye 2 feet higher than the anchors used so far. Museum contractors had covered its floor marking, but the eye itself remained behind a removable acoustic panel on the raised walkway. Because it sat higher, a cable routed through it could pass above the SUV's hood and return to the Duesenberg through a second pulley. The route required a double-line pull. It would move the load more slowly while reducing the force on each segment. More importantly, it changed the cable geometry without placing anyone beside the unstable SUV. Jonah located the acoustic panel by counting expansion joints from the column. He removed 2 hand fasteners and found the anchor exactly where the photograph showed it. The inspection tag remained current. Daniel and the fire chief checked its capacity against the measured rolling resistance and approved the route. Rebecca asked what she could do. Daniel gave her the only useful job available to an untrained person: stand at the command board and repeat the fire chief's remaining time over the headset every 2 minutes. She did not touch a cable, vehicle, or control. With 11 minutes and 58 seconds left, the F600 took tension on the double line. The old truck's engine settled under load. Daniel watched the load cell, Jonah watched the Duesenberg's rear clearance, and 2 spotters watched the front corners from the elevated walkways. The car rolled away from the barrier in increments measured by inches. The first turn used nearly the full empty space created by the Oldsmobile. Daniel stopped when the right front tire reached the chalk arc he had drawn years earlier. Jonah shifted the rear bridle to center the pull. No one hurried the connection. A rushed hook placed in the wrong direction could undo every minute saved. 9 minutes remained. The Duesenberg entered the ramp line with 6 minutes and 32 seconds left. The high cable cleared the SUV by 4 inches. At the grade break, the car's long rear overhang approached the wet concrete. Daniel slowed the winch until the spotter called 1 inch, then half an inch. The rear cleared without contact. 5 minutes and 42 seconds remained when the front wheels reached the dry upper ramp. The F600 continued pulling until the Duesenberg crossed the fire chief's closure line with 5 minutes and 12 seconds left. With 4 minutes and 42 seconds left, Jonah chalked it in the staging zone and disconnected the bridle. The fire chief immediately ended lower-level operations. His crew swept the raised walkways and verified every person at the command point with 3 minutes and 8 seconds still on the clock, preserving the required reserve. At 4:05 exactly, he disconnected the remaining building service. Portable pumps running from fire department generators continued for another 40 minutes before debris disabled them, but no car and no worker remained below. Before anyone touched the recovered vehicles beyond stabilization, Rebecca, Daniel, Marcus, the registrar, and the insurer's remote adjuster completed a joint walk-around. They distinguished pre-existing scratches, wet tire lines, extraction contact, and uncertain marks. The Oldsmobile's right front dolly had rubbed a wheel cover. Daniel accepted responsibility under the emergency order. The mark cost less than the damage that a locked steering wheel could have caused, but it still belonged in the report. The fire chief conducted a crew debrief while details remained fresh. 2 headset batteries had dropped below half, the acoustic panel location was poorly marked, and the return path for personnel could be clearer. No one waited for the successful outcome to harden into a legend. The first corrections were written before the emergency vehicles left. Daniel shut down the F600 and rested his hand on the worn shift lever. The rescue had not saved dozens of vehicles through impossible speed. It had moved exactly 6 in 68 minutes and 46 seconds, using spaces created in a planned sequence. One more locked wheel, one missing anchor, or one unauthorized person in the work area could have changed the result. Outside, Rebecca walked past the dry cars in their extraction order. The Oldsmobile staff wagon stood first, muddy and ordinary. The Duesenberg stood last, its black body reflecting emergency lights. The order made the lesson visible without Daniel explaining it. Neil approached Rebecca with a statement blaming the barrier contractor for an unforeseeable equipment failure. She refused to sign. The storm threshold had been forecast. Daniel's warning had been received. Event material blocked a tested safety device. Management delayed moving the cars. The contractor's equipment would be investigated, but the evacuation decision belonged to the collection. Rebecca placed Neil on administrative leave after the fire chief released him from emergency duty. She commissioned an independent incident review led by a flood engineer, an insurer representative, a museum registrar, and a recovery specialist unaffiliated with Daniel. She gave the panel access to her own messages as well as Neil's. Daniel submitted a complete recovery log before midnight. Jonah's board listed each vehicle, start time, anchor route, measured force, pause, and exit time. Photographs showed pre-existing condition and water exposure. The record protected the collection's insurance claim and Daniel's crew from later accusations that extraction caused damage already present. The Duesenberg required conservation drying and fluid inspection, but no floodwater entered its cabin. The Mercedes showed moisture at one wheel bearing. The Corvette's tire had scuffed the floating wooden event panel, but its fiberglass body was unmarked. The Oldsmobile needed the most cleaning because it had crossed the muddy corner first. None had been started while wet. Rebecca paid Daniel's emergency invoice under the signed work order. Riverside separately replaced its own dolly with the bent latch that Daniel had rejected, and it reimbursed Rusk Recovery for the winch cable section retired after inspection. She did not offer him a vague reward for saving millions. Every amount tied to labor, equipment, or documented loss. The canceled truck sale remained Daniel's problem. The buyer had wanted the F600 as a restored advertising piece for a brewery. Commercial flood work exposed its frame and drivetrain to water spray and voided the cosmetic delivery condition. Daniel returned the deposit from the emergency payment, leaving too little for the equipment note due Friday. Cal Becker came to the shop when Daniel returned the deposit. He was disappointed but not cheated. The contract had anticipated exactly that outcome. After seeing the recovery photographs, he offered to buy the Ford anyway at a lower price, and keep the winch connected as part of the display. Daniel declined. The new offer treated the truck's working history as decoration while still removing it from service. Daniel called the equipment lender before the Friday deadline and disclosed the canceled sale. The lender granted a 14-day extension in exchange for the emergency invoice and Rebecca's written confirmation that Riverside's board would consider a new contract. Daniel paid an extension fee. His principled choice carried an actual cost, even though the rescue later created work. He also paid his 3 employees the hazardous condition premium listed in company policy. Only Jonah had joined him below, but the others managed dispatch, exterior equipment, and customer cancellations. Daniel did not use the emergency as a reason to postpone wages while protecting his own note. Jonah asked whether they should have let the buyer take it before the storm. Daniel said the sale had been reasonable when the collection contract disappeared. He did not claim he had always known the Ford's worth. An old truck could be useful and still cost money to own. Its winch needed inspection, its brakes needed service, and rust did not become honorable merely because photographs looked good. 3 days later, Rebecca came to Rusk Recovery with the independent panel's preliminary findings. She offered Daniel his old towing contract back at the previous rate, plus a public apology. Daniel declined. The previous contract paid for routine transport and expected emergency planning as unpaid advice. It allowed the collection to reject his equipment based on appearance without comparing clearance, reach, or recovery scenarios. Taking it back unchanged would restore his income and preserve the same failure. Daniel proposed a different arrangement. Rusk Recovery would provide documented evacuation planning, twice-yearly drills, equipment compatibility checks, and emergency response under separate paid rates. The collection would maintain its own dollies, access keys, anchors, and printed plans. No preview, donor, or auction schedule could override the named flood threshold without a written executive exception sent to the insurer. Rebecca's counsel objected to giving an outside contractor sequence authority over collection assets. Daniel agreed that ownership decisions belonged to the museum during ordinary operations. Once an emergency work order activated, the fire authority controlled safety and the recovery lead controlled vehicle movement. Competing authority before the work order had nearly cost them the Duesenberg. Rebecca took the proposal to her board instead of accepting it privately. The incident panel supported it. The insurer offered a premium reduction if the collection adopted the threshold, drill, and key control provisions. The board approved a 2-year consulting and recovery contract at a rate that paid for preparation as real work. The first contract payment covered Daniel's equipment note. It did not make him wealthy or restore the canceled sale. He kept the F600 because the new scope required a low-clearance recovery asset. He also purchased a used modern medium-duty truck for ordinary roadside work, refusing to make one old machine solve every problem. Rebecca's board corrected more than the contract. It rescheduled the donor preview, published an incident summary, and admitted that management delayed evacuation after receiving a valid warning. The collection moved all irreplaceable vehicles out of the basement during flood season. The lower room became a workshop and storage area for objects that could be evacuated by pallet. The insurer did not excuse Riverside merely because the cars survived. Its review found that the delayed response increased both exposure and recovery cost. The company paid the covered conservation claims but raised the collection's deductible until the new controls passed a full drill. That financial consequence reached the board more clearly than any speech from Daniel. Rebecca attached Daniel's original emails to the board minutes. She also included his failure to renew the old plan in the digital system. The record showed management's greater error without turning Daniel into a man incapable of mistakes. Rusk Recovery adopted its own rule, requiring annual written acceptance of every client emergency plan. If a client did not acknowledge the plan, Daniel would document that it was advisory only and price future emergency work accordingly. Riverside's revised threshold used river forecasts, barrier status, and vehicle move time. Staff no longer waited for water at the door. When 2 triggers were met, the registrar initiated relocation and notified leadership. An executive could delay only by signing a named exception that went automatically to the insurer. Rebecca had authority, but no longer invisible authority. Neil's final review found no bribery or secret scheme. He had prioritized an important event, trusted a recently tested barrier, and dismissed an old recovery plan because its truck and floor markings looked out of place in a polished museum. Those decisions were understandable one at a time and indefensible together. He left the collection after accepting a separation agreement that did not erase the findings. Daniel asked that none of the incident materials call him the man who saved the collection alone. Jonah had located the high anchor. Firefighters had enforced boundaries. Museum technicians rigged dollies and moved equipment. The registrar preserved warnings. The order worked because people accepted roles, not because Daniel performed 6 impossible rescues by himself. Rusk Recovery used part of its first-year profit to buy 2 portable flood barriers and a set of rated dollies for the county volunteer rescue team. Rebecca's company matched the equipment cost through a direct donation to the county. No vehicle in the collection carried a sponsor plaque for it. Jonah stayed with the business, but not because the flood transformed him into his father's apprentice. He had already earned his certification and had been considering a job with an industrial rigging firm in Kansas City. Daniel offered him a defined role as planning manager, a written salary, and authority to reject unsafe equipment. Jonah accepted for 1 year with a review date. Family did not replace employment terms. Together they rebuilt the floor plan digitally. Jonah linked every anchor to its inspection record and every parking position to a vehicle weight and turning envelope. Daniel added one low-tech requirement: a laminated paper copy at every exit. Servers, batteries, and wireless networks could fail in the same storm. At the first evacuation drill, Rebecca deliberately placed a low-value sedan in the corner and a high-value car at the rear. A new facilities supervisor ordered the sedan first without asking for auction values. Staff removed 4 practice vehicles in 26 minutes under dry conditions. They stopped once when a headset failed and resumed only after the backup line was connected. The F600 did not lead every drill. Sometimes the modern truck handled open-lot pulls because its rotating boom and stabilizers were better tools there. Sometimes an electric tug moved cars on level ground with no cable at all. The lesson was never that old equipment beat new equipment. The lesson was that specifications and access decided fitness. During winter, Daniel and Jonah stripped the Ford service brakes, inspected the winch, replaced corroded wiring, and repaired frame sections identified by measurement. They left the faded red cab, hand-lettered doors, and dented fenders alone. The truck no longer had to look worthless to prove it worked, and it did not need glossy paint to become safe. Rebecca visited the shop when the work was complete. She brought the original termination letter that had called the F600 visually incompatible with donor-facing operations. She asked Daniel whether he wanted it removed from the company's record. He told her to keep it beside the new equipment policy. A correction meant more when the original mistake remained visible. 1 year after the flood, river forecasts crossed the evacuation threshold again. The sky over St. Louis was clear when the alert arrived. Heavy rain was still a day away upstream. The collection canceled an evening event and began moving vehicles at noon. No water had entered the basement, and no camera crew waited. Daniel positioned the F600 beneath the same concrete header. Jonah checked the high left anchor, now marked by a clean, permanent sign. Staff moved the practice Oldsmobile first, opening the corner for everything behind it. Rebecca stood at the command board and read the sequence without changing it. The Duesenberg waited last in a dry room, not because it mattered least, but because the route protected it best. When the final car crossed the ramp, Daniel disengaged the winch. Jonah drew one short line through the completed list with the grease pencil his father had used during the flood. Behind them, the old Ford idled under a clearance bar that the expensive truck still could not pass, doing exactly the job its measurements said it could do, and no more.